Hey, good evening. It's Patrick Global Truth Bomb riffing on Saturday evening, July 15th, 2023 at approximately 7:45 p.m. my time. And as I look around me at this beautiful evening, after experiencing some significant heat today, I love summer. And but I got to tell you, where I'm sitting and where I happen to see in some of my social media feeds, folks that I know that live in California and some in Arizona and Nevada were posting pictures on their phone of temperatures as high as 120 degrees. And yeah, it certainly was hot where I am, definitely triple digits. And, I guess to be expected uh, in the summertime, as well as, of course, July, the peak heat in North America. But at the same time, we've seen some heavy duty temperatures breaking a lot of records. And, it just feels like hell for a lot of people, hotter than hell. And, I guess that's the theme of tonight's Truth Bomb to an extent. I don't know about you, if you believe in an afterlife, if you believe in some sort of higher being or somebody manipulating, the power behind the scenes. I don't particularly believe in that sort of scenario. I've got a lot more complex view of the world, mostly based on a scientific sort of come from. But yeah, certainly the life is the world and history and everything else is filled with extraordinary mysteries. And boy, do I love literature, and boy, do I love poetry. And whether or not Lucifer is a thing or the embodiment, within the dark souls of ourselves, I don't know if there needs to be much difference other than, I guess, eternity, which may or may not be something to be concerned about. But at the same time, it was a theme of of mine and a couple of things that I did this week that I think a lot of you are going to be able to relate to. And hopefully understand where I'm coming from in this whole process because of what we're up against. So, I, you know, one of the films that I quote all the time as kind of an inspiration for my journey, which really began in 2011. So I'm here, pretty much in the midst of my 13-year odyssey, and I always quoted. Um, The Usual Suspects. There was a wonderful film, won an Academy Award in 1995, one of my favorite films of all time. And Kevin Spacey's character, quoted after he realized he's been piecing everything together, that the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. I always found that profound and shocking, especially given what that movie executed brilliantly in terms of its narrative, and what ultimately his character was in the midst of when he made that proclamation. But that statement, I believe, may have come out of 15th century France with another sort of insightful, wise proclamation by a French writer at that time period. And it had a bunch of different sort of corollaries throughout history. I think back sometimes to Dante's Inferno, staying within the theme. Quite frankly, I think which was written in the 13th century, I believe. And I think the ninth rung of hell, or Inferno, was deception of power and betrayal, and all of those things that come with the Hippocratic or the hypocrisy and the complicity of power, which was Dante's worst sin, which I found extremely fascinating when I ultimately it occurred to me. But I happened to mention this on Twitter the other night. I said that the more I think about it, Lucifer threw the kitchen sink at me, and I'm still standing. He couldn't allow 100 million plus people to know what happened. So he had the DOJ and Congress dance for Wall Street's corruption. He sold the world that 700 billion was the fix as he backdoored 29 trillion to the bastards that destroyed a nation. He bought Congress, the media, the judiciary, and he thought we'd cave. He almost erased the truth from history, but he never understood that where I come from, evil can go fuck itself. Everything I lost in this process was a small price to pay if I can connect with millions of you to open the door to come to grips with how an entire nation was betrayed by deception and greed. It's time to shine the light of truth on the wickedness of the pathological psychopaths who will one day meet their reckoning. And when they do, they'll have me to thank for it. It felt good. It felt good to say that, and it felt good, in context to everything that I'm seeing, and I'm trying to, create. But I have this insane, frustration that regardless of how monumental the truths are that we've been professing for a long time and declaring the evidence through our work at www.thecon.tv, as well as a great podcast that we produced with our friends at the Real Progressives called The New Untouchables. And then, of course, I've got Truth Bombs on YouTube as well as um, TikTok. Interestingly enough, I've had over 7.5 million views on TikTok. But they haven't translated to 7.5 million people being on board this movement that I'm trying to create with some incredible people that have been so grateful. I'm so grateful for because of their time commitment and everything that they do and their wisdom and their incitement and their friendship and that sort of thing. Because when you have people that believe in you, you can believe in yourself. And we have to come together. And, so thank God they're in the mix. And, but, my performance, my numbers on YouTube, for example, aren't terribly impressive. Maybe I'm up against a much harder grind on YouTube, given that YouTube's a lot more mature, and I knew that there was a lot of changes. I think circa night 2018, maybe even going as far back as 2017. I know Trump was in the midst of it, and I can't remember what the actual um, bill was that he signed into law that enabled all of these tech engines to basically stack the deck of how people are going to be able to get the message out, that sort of thing. Everybody knows that we're under the lock and key of algorithms. But I wonder if I would have had this information out there in 2014, 2012, 2013, 2014 sort of thing, that I would have beat that sort of demarcation point and realized by now millions of followers and millions of people that are involved. But as of yet, I think we've got 621 followers on my YouTube channel. So please like and subscribe. Please help that along. And everybody that's involved, thank you. I deeply appreciate your support, but we have to grow the circle. There is no ands, ifs, or buts about it. And I was happy to see, I started experimenting with Twitter Spaces. And I did an impromptu discussion with my friend and colleague, Paris Dubé, out of Tampa Bay, Florida. And as of me hitting record on this, I think we had been viewed somewhere. You know how you see those little analytics on the side where who knows how many people actually watched it all the way through. It's like an hour and 35 minutes, and we definitely reveal some very, very important information. I don't know how many likes there were, but it certainly wasn't as many views as there are. But I think there was like almost close to 3,700. We're approaching 4,000 views, which is great for something I didn't even promote, and which gives me a slight hope that hopefully we're starting to tap the vein of people that are interested in understanding. You shouldn't be interested, but you've got to get in the door some way. But the desperation of this insanity of what we're revealing to you, which is the core of all corruption. And why is it important to understand corruption? Because as we all know, corruption takes many forms, and corruption has always been around. I mean, kind of thinking about Dante's Inferno, I'm sure he was actually, kind of in the midst of what ultimately became the Reformation as he wrote that. Because, if you know your European medieval history, I mean, after the Dark Ages and the plagues, we wind up with the Renaissance. But in between, there was the Reformation and the Great Schisms. And there was, through the Holy Roman Empire and all of the different schisms that took place and all of the different, Lutheranism and, Methodists and others that came at that time period, Lutheran coming top to mind. But it was based on corruption because, the priests were selling, the sacrament and not sacrament, forgiveness, right, for sins. And so it kind of set the table for a millennia of what we ended up seeing in films, as I was growing up in mafia films, of course, where mob bosses get to go to their priest, make a donation, and they'll say, they'll forgive them their sins. Which I always thought was ridiculous, but I get it. Um, but at the same time, it's just it's a fascinating thing. But my point with regards to you know corruption and the notion of Lucifer and the systemology of power and complicity and humanity and how we have to operate within society can skew so many different ways as it has throughout history, but more so towards evil, more towards darkness, towards complicity in a system that uses relentless power to brutalize a population until it's in complete control. I mean, that's history for the most part. And then the United States comes around, courageously fights for higher, uh, you know, higher humanity through the humanities, through the great philosophers of England and France, and how that sifted in through history and our founding fathers for all of their flaws and everything else. But at the same time, it was a learned intellectual process that created separation of powers and, of course, a judiciary and a system that could hold power to account, first and foremost. And what we're in the midst of course, is just the inverse of that, which is corruption. Because mankind can, of course, lie. And deception, I would like most of us would think is evil, but then, of course, there is evil amongst us um, infinitum. And ultimately, complicity is when it gets out of control. And we're beginning to see, what we've had tentacles of and roots of, with white supremacy in the United States for our entire history. But, for the last 40, 50 years, I mean, there's always been this kind of, back and forth between consolidated, machinations of corporate power and religious power that manifest what some people might call the patriarchy, but, might be white supremacy, right? And then it's been battling with civil rights and on overdrive, post Civil War through the progressive movements, and then of course, our war with fascism and all of these incredible sacrifices. And so, that's American history, but we're smack dab in the middle of what we have to do, what we the people have to do. What I'm trying to get your attention, your buy-in, your complete convergence and emergence, and what it is that I'm expressing to you. Because if you understand what's at stake, and you're not a Nazi, and you don't want to play a part of a tribe of a white supremacist tribe that completely suborns and suppresses everybody else, so that what you can be a slave, but a slightly higher level slave than the slave masters. I would have been on the side. I always love to use references to Game of Thrones, and I was certainly, and I think I've mentioned this, and if you've watched it before, I'm sorry if I repeat it, but I was definitely on, Team Stark, right? Obviously, in all things Jon Snow eventually, but my favorite character was Arya Stark and the Hound, quite frankly, in their role. But right up there was Daenerys Targaryen, right? Because she was the breaker of chains and everything that meant, and she was going to break the wheel, and she delivered, quite frankly. Those of you who love the show, we could debate about the ending and what that meant and all that sort of stuff, but it's just a a cultural reference that I think personifies everything that's happened in history, minus of course the dragons, which of course isn't another illusion, but is kind of the dragons in ourselves, Lucifer and Christ and the light and everything else, right? Good versus evil. I mean, that's the story of eternity. We all knew it, sitting in theaters our whole lives, movie theaters our whole lives, and it just amazes me, because if you look at around today at this, at what we're looking at, around the United States, it just appears to me that maybe 70% of the audience back in the day, when we were like in these blockbuster Star Wars films, were secretly rooting for Darth Vader. I mean, it's not funny, because that's what we're looking at here, right? At least if you come from my generation, X generation. So, but look, the big marquee stuff that I want to bring to your attention in the context of what this movement is about, what the con is about, what I've been in the midst of, and going through, and I got to give you some perspective as I go through this. Like I mentioned, my journey started in 2011, and my first film was Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. And I had to set the table by understanding power. And by understanding power, I was able to understand the intricacies of what happens with the, board of directors and all of these different operations and companies, these multinationals that basically create a revolving door of board of directors. So you might have you might have, big tech, like Apple, but what we've always had, quite frankly, is big finance, like any major player on Wall Street, integrated with big oil. So these guys from Goldman Sachs would sit on boards for Exxon and Texaco and whatever else, and their interests were shared. Okay, and that was pretty much standard for like the last 30 years. But not too many people, I think, Americans really kind of think about corporate structure and control, especially as it relates to our country. Because I think the idea that most of us buy into is like, okay, you get a job, you go to work, you raise a family, you get a house, you buy into the system, you go your way the way you got to do it, you learn through life and everything else, you celebrate your religion, you've got freedoms, and you have the freedom to choose your elected leaders, right? And so, we always had this sort of thing where the Democrats, had this sort of platform and the Republicans had this sort of platform. And, a lot of people got to the point, in the last 2 decades, choose the lesser of two evils. But now it's just, we realize they're all playing for the same team. And what I mean by the same team is the corporate juggernaut that has absolute control, which has evolved really, on overdrive since 2008, even more so than ever before. It was going that way in the late 90s in a big way, but by the time we got to 2008, it was a complete smash and grab, complete monopolization at that point, and everything else is secondary. And what everybody's starting to now realize, and we're digging out of the rubble, and there's so many fractured sort of scenarios where people are trying to find some sort of way through this and where to latch on and where do they latch on, and there's a lot of people that are veterans of this whole thing too, right? So in the modern era, going back to 2011 when I started my journey, that's when Occupy Wall Street exploded all over the country, and about the same time, so too did the Tea Party. Two different reactions, right, through this ideological sort of lens that came out of the one of the worst, bubble and crashes, if not the worst, quite frankly, in history. So this is all a continuation of that. So Occupy Wall Street basically manifested into Bernie Sanders' campaign. Of course, the Tea Party got confangled and manifested into MAGA. And meanwhile, the Democratic Wall Street meritocracy that's engaged with financing and funding all things with a heavy sort of assist, if not a collaboration with big law in this country. That's pretty much the status quo, which many people actually regard as the deep state, and it is. It really is. But it's not the focus of this particular Truth Bomb riff to go into that detail so much as just to kind of set the table for a couple of things. Like always, I try to bring in these truth bombs that are happening right in front of our face that are completely sort of intersect with everything that I'm telling you. So the first thing over the course of the last 24 hours was Ron or Rob Perlman, the actor, great actor. I loved him in what is it? I can't think of this, the robots with Pacific Rim, but he's been in so many other things. Fantastic guy. Hellboy, stay within the theme. Ron Perlman. Anyway, so he does this video last night as a result of the actor strike, and he's addressing what is obviously some sort of executive who threatened within the corridors of what everybody in Hollywood's dealing with, like, look, we're going to starve out all the actors until they lose their houses, until they lose their jobs and their apartments, and we starve them to death, basically, right? And Perlman's message was, we know where you live, motherfucker. And it was a great message. And it was an empowering message, because it's like, who the fuck is this executive to piss on everybody? And we know anybody who's paying attention to the writer's strike and the Screen Actors Guild, that AI is a big concern, not to mention streaming and the rights and how all of this works and where everybody's expendable. And Hollywood's now suddenly coming to the realization of everything I've been laying on the world for the last 2 years. We released The Con in November of December of 2020. What am I saying? 2019, 2020. So we've been out there like what, 3 years? Or no, it's 2021. I mean, because November 2020, and then we didn't really kind of get out there until 2021. So like 2.5 years basically. Anyway, bottom line is that we got completely suppressed and crushed, and nobody understands the whole story of what it is that we lay out. Now, concurrently, and I've been using these sorts of riffs and trying to get the attention of a lot of people out there that no matter what your issue is, and this is my my sort of go-to. If you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity and decency and sustainability and integrity, we must merge in unity to defeat the tyranny of the misery of tyranny. Yeah, that's exactly right. Right. So for everybody who knows that there are problems with the climate, which we're reminded of every single day, and I just happened to listen to right before I push play on this, I listened to this really, really scary video cast from these scientists from all around the world, primarily the UK, Australia, several from the United States, and one from Brazil, talking about really urgent, extraordinary problems as it relates to sea ice formation in Antarctica and what's not happening. And then also it tied into all of these like unbelievable revelations of huge temperature increases in the oceans around the world. Not, I'm not just talking about the heat domes that have been, trapped over Texas and Arizona and California and the Southwest and places that are always very hot, but like extremely ridiculously hot, to ways that, they're becoming more and more extreme. And as I was listening to these scientists, some of whom were young, but they all had PhDs and they were all absolutely brilliant. And, you could tell that they didn't want to make it such a downer that, the world is ending. But that's basically what they were saying, as the world was ending. And the interesting question that came up was, okay, so what can we do? Here are the scientists that figured out the problems for the last several decades, and they're like, what do we do to fix this problem? And here I am. That's the intersection with you and me. I've got the answers of how to fix the problem. Now, meanwhile, I was also struck, for example, that what they were talking about felt like stuff I had seen in the late 90s, early 2000s, that preceded all of these sort of international conferences, that, like, for example, Paris, and then earlier in Rio and that sort of thing, where the globe came together to try to work on markers to try to get, emissions down and, particles per million down, that sort of thing. But we haven't done it, and we haven't done it over the course of 20 years. And I felt like it, I felt the same conversation 20 years ago. In fact, I was reminded of all the stuff that I studied for my film Forward 13, which that was the whole point of Forward 13, was to present that that's my first documentary film, and this is what I learned when I started pulling on the threads and asking the right questions. We're not a democracy. We're a corporate state, a corporate fascist state, to be more specific. And then after I discovered the con, a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism to fuel the betrayal. And now it's birthing fascism. So, as I'm listening to these scientists, I was reminded of all the work I'd listened to from one of the greatest, saints in science in the history of the world, who told us what was coming. A guy by the name of Dr. James Hansen at the Goddard Space Institute, who was telling us this was going to come as early as 1995, because his study was on Mercury, right? And Venus too. And, how those planets, created the systems that they did. And he's seeing the same thing happen on Earth, right? But by our own hand. Now, meanwhile, I do know that, like 97% of species have gone extinct in Central America over the course of the last 10 years. Extremely insane numbers of wildlife and vegetation going extinct. And I'm a kind of guy that I love life. I have empathy. I love the survival. I'm the guy that, when I grew up and I'm watching, these stories, animated stories, for example, I was always like a big fan of like Rikki Tikki Tavi, for example, among others. But that one stands out in my mind because, there was the snake in the grass and, and he would fight and be courageous for the family and protect him and everything else. But I just love wildlife. I love species. I love understanding ecosystems and how this brilliant work of the earth, has made it such that, that life can exist. And I'm just so profoundly touched by that. That is to me what is God, quite frankly. That to me is this ecosystem when you understand the universe and the galaxy and, these extraordinary, tiny percentages of the fact that life exists here on Earth. But meanwhile, you kind of find out that, oh, yeah, life might not be so, you know, it could be all over the universe, right? But the universe is so gargantuan, we might never know. So we may as well treat this as our last chance. And we're all in the midst of this, sixth extinction. And it's happening right before our eyes. And it's not that we didn't see this coming. We've known this since the 70s. But what happened in the interim was the corporations, through the complicity of the judiciary and the legal system and Congress and corruption, were able to make it such that even though we had 9/11 and Saudi Arabia was deeply involved with 9/11, you find out later that, okay, we're not going to ask the right questions. And oh, yeah, by the way, the dollar in its global hegemony is basically dependent upon being the reserve currency and trading, for international oil, right? Particularly from the swing producer of Saudi. Yeah, that's the system, guys. And so we've had so much tragedy over the course of the last 10 years. 9/11, the following wars, 20 years of war that we never would go after Saudi Arabia, even though you got to go back to understand a little perspective of Saudi Arabia. We had an agreement right after World War II between us and the Saudis that were like, we're going to provide you military support and you're going to provide us oil. And that was the deal. And that has been the deal ever since. And now, because of the BRICS countries, and, I think it was, Mohammed bin Sultan 2 weeks ago said, I don't care what the Americans think anymore. Meanwhile, we're the ones who built the entire infrastructure that this guy is leveraging over us. And our leaders allow that to happen, which we would have never allowed to happen if we told the truth of Saudi Arabia and we took care of business. But we were so leveraged by this corporate state that's so deeply immersed with fossil fuel, and that basically drives the global economy that we've built through neoliberalism for the last 4 or 5 decades. And it ultimately, and this is the whole point, it destroyed capitalism. I know that there's so many people who want to blame this as capital. It's not capitalism. It's a corporate fascist state that is undergirded by a criminal syndicate because it's not sustainable. And that got proven in the 2008 Great Financial Crisis based on everything that I have been revealing to you. And there was a guy that popped up on somebody's feed earlier today that I read that was like, look, I understand that you guys are passionate about the con, but it's so much more than that. And I've got my own ideas, and it goes back to Reagan and yada, yada, yada. Yeah, you can't tell the history of the world to the whole world all the time. They're not going to listen. The bottom line is that what we've got in the con, which is available for free at www.thecon.tv, is the evidence and the revelations of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that buried north of 100 million people through a racketeering enterprise that the full faith and credit of the United States backstopped illegally. So the bad guys got away with it. And that's the story of our times. And it's like they've hijacked the economy and they're flying us into the Twin Towers. And you've got to fucking get up. You've got to join me. You got to lock arms. You got to know what the facts are. You got to know how to defeat this stuff. And again, I'll say what I always say, and it's, look, we got to create a tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption. And if you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, that believes in dignity and decency and integrity and sustainability, and we merge in unity, we will defeat and triumph over the misery of tyranny because we're smart enough to deal with all of these problems. We can. We already have an infrastructure to where we can go, recreate the grid. We don't have to depend on Saudi. You look at the Salton Sea in California. It's like this mother lode of silicon, or what am I? It's not silicon. I'm sorry. It's what do we put in electric batteries? It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, look. We can transition. We have to transition. There is got to be the free market immersed in a sort of vision quest way that acknowledges the truth of everything. And we've got to use the integrity of the law to get rid of the bad guys. We've got to purge corruption. We've got to crush corruption. And we've got to crush the fascism it feeds. And that's who I am. And that's what I do day in and day out. And it's growing. And I'm going to have tomorrow night, I think I'm going to do a Twitter live, Twitter Spaces with Bruce Jacobs, who, if it doesn't matter if you know anything about the foreclosure madness and everything else, if you're interested in Trump and what he's getting away with, I'm going to reveal to you through Bruce Jacobs facts of insanity that's taking place in our courts that have bulldozed and destroyed millions of people. And now his career has been destroyed. And just like I said at the outset, this whole system circled the wagons and prevented us from getting the truth to the world and actually being able to have a sort of market based solution for it, because there's just too much madness and everybody buys lies. I'm looking for people that aren't suckers, that want to freaking rise up and defeat the enemies that are evil. And that's all there is to it. And I don't know what else to tell you. It's the end of the line. This is 23 years after, or maybe 30 years after I knew most of these things, particularly intuitively. But I remember going to like U2 concerts, especially U2 concerts, Grateful Dead shows. I've been to so many concerts throughout my life, but particularly U2. We were singing and joining arms and chanting and doing things where hundreds of thousands of us were on the same page decades ago. And then what happened? We all got sucked up into the system and had families and had to get a house and a car, and now our children are going to college, and so you're like, what are you going to do, right? Just like what the hippie generation did before, and then they all went into Wall Street by the time we were in college, sort of thing. I mean, guys, I don't know if you get it. There are solutions that will happen in this renaissance to save us from ourselves if we purge the evil of corruption. And so I'll finish up with Sympathy for the Devil, one of my favorite songs. In fact, this was going to be the final song of season 2 of the con if we could, if I ever got that on the air. But I think it's worth repeating, and I know you all know the words. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I've been around for a long, long years, and I've stole many a man's soul and faith. I was around when Jesus cried, had his moment in doubt and pain, made damn sure the pilot washed his hands and sealed his fate. Pleased to meet you. I hope you guessed my name, but what's puzzling you is the nature of my game. I stuck around St. Petersburg when I saw it was for a time for a change, killed the Tsar and his ministers, and Anastasia screamed in vain. I rode the tank in the general's rank, held general's rank, when the blitzkrieg raged and the bodies stank. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guessed my name. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. I watched with glee while your kings and queens fought for 10 decades in the gods they made. I shouted out who killed the Kennedys when after all it was you and me. Let me please introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste, and I lay traps for troubadours who get killed before they reach Bombay. Just as every cop is a criminal and all the sinners saints, as heads as tails, just call me Lucifer, 'cause I'm in need of some restraint. So if you meet me, have some courtesy, have some sympathy and some taste. Use all your well-learned politeness, or I'll lay your soul to waste. And you know the rest. Look, man, if that doesn't describe the world we live in, I don't know what does. And again, I don't walk on water, my friends. I didn't part the Red Sea. But I'm leading this supercharge to crush fucking evil, because we can. Because when you have the truth, you're bulletproof. And this is in service of exodus from corruption to resurrect the American dream. Failure is not an option. Rise, roar, revolt, onwards and upwards.